In the distant future, the year 2000, Ridley Scott gave us Gladiator, a swords and sandals blockbuster that took its inspiration from the glory days of the historical epic, but used modern filmmaking techniques and special effects to deliver a bloody, exciting, and surprisingly emotional story about a general who became a slave, who became a gladiator, who defied an emperor. And even though the movie made about $500 million and won 5 Oscars, it's taken Ridley Scott 24 years to finally release a Gladiator sequel, and it's called Gladiator 2.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, loyal servant to the true emperor, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next.
It seems obvious in hindsight that Gladiator would have been a hit. A big-budget historical action movie with a rugged and charismatic hero fighting for love and justice, and directed by the guy who made Blade Runner and Alien. But at the time it was being made, this $103 million epic faced countless delays, script rewrites, and other production problems that included one of the lead actors dying halfway through filming because he got into a drinking competition and presumably lost. And while production on the Mescal vs Pascal sequel has been, by comparison, much smoother than the chaos of Gladiator 1, it still took a very long and very weird road to get here. Because after the runaway success of Gladiator, Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe tried to get a sequel off the ground more or less immediately, and so they took the obvious step of hiring Nick Cave to write a screenplay. Now, you might think that hiring a rock star with no screenwriting experience to write the sequel to a grounded and realistic historical epic that ends with the main character dying would be a terrible idea. And you'd be right. That screenplay had the working title of Christ Killer, and I'm not joking here, would have involved a resurrected Russell Crowe hunting Jesus on behalf of the gods of the Roman underworld, and then living an eternal life that sees him fighting in all the wars throughout history until he winds up in the modern day Pentagon. So basically the opening scene of Wolverine Origins, but with a different Australian. So ahead of Gladiator 2's release, let's take a look at both the tortured production history of Gladiator, as well as the long and windy road to finally get a sequel nearly quarter of a century later. And to do that, we need to take a step back in time, because the story of Gladiator and Gladiator 2 starts in 1972 when a 25-year-old David Franzoni was traveling through Europe and the Middle East. As you might have seen in the video that I filmed in Jordan, there are Roman amphitheaters and Colosseums scattered everywhere across the Mediterranean, and this was what inspired Franzoni to pick up a copy of the book Those About to Die by Daniel P. Mannix. This book was the genesis of Gladiator, but not because the story bears any resemblance to the movie. No, what Franzoni took from Mannix's book was the vibes.
The thing that was great about Mannix's book was that it identified the ancient games with sort of modern entertainment games.
The book described the way in which the gladiatorial arena had all of the drama of modern sports, but with literal life and death stakes. And more than that, it just conveyed the sheer spectacle of it all. The brutality, the violence, the animals, the rivalries. Reading about all of these grisly details, Franzoni knew that it would make the backdrop to a fantastic movie. But it took another 25 years or so for that vision to be realized. Franzoni had written the screenplay for Steven Spielberg's Amistad, and while that was filming in Rome, he did what all men apparently do and began thinking about the Roman Empire, and that reminded him of his idea for Gladiator. Spielberg encouraged Franzoni to write the script, and DreamWorks producer Walter Parkes approached Ridley Scott to direct. And you know that saying about a picture being worth 1,000 words?
And we brought the script, and we also brought a painting, a famous painting of the arena.
The artist was Jean-Léon Gérôme, and it was entitled Thumbs Down.
I remember showing him the picture, and then launched into the pitch. Doug and I told him about how we're going to change the script and what our ideas are, and he'd be looking at me very interested, and his eyes would glaze slightly, and his eyes kept on going to the picture. And I think halfway through, without really hearing the pitch at all, he picked up the print and said, "Yeah, I can do this."
Like Franzoni, Ridley Scott was more inspired by the vibes than the specifics. And when the lead role was offered to Russell Crowe, guess what? He was also being sold on the vibes.
He said, it's a $100 million film, you're being directed by Ridley Scott, and you play a Roman general.
It was a pretty good sales pitch to the up-and-coming actor who was fresh off the Oscar-nominated LA Confidential. But this is where Gladiator's problems really begin, because vibes are all very well and good when you're brainstorming ideas, but when you get given $103 million to make a movie on location, you kinda need to nail down the specifics.
And I read the script, and it was substantially underdone. And even the character wasn't existent on the pages. I mean, we actually started shooting with about 32 pages. Went through them in the first couple of weeks. Here was a situation where we got to Morocco with a crew of 200 and a cast of 100 or whatever, and I didn't have anything to learn. I actually didn't know what the scenes were going to be.
Franzoni's original script had been based around actual Roman historical figures, and while it provided the framework of the story, neither Ridley Scott nor Russell Crowe particularly liked the dialogue.
I mean, when the character was first called Narcissus, right? The character's called Narcissus, and he's going on a journey of vengeance for his wife's death. It's like, do you know what you're talking about, the fellow who wrote it?
It was issues like that which made Ridley Scott bring on John Logan. He was hired because, as a playwright, he knew how to give the story a clear 3-act structure and knew how to write interesting dialogue.
Doing these things, you're always trying to find the level of dialogue that flies so it doesn't become a deeply period piece where you lose 9/10 of the audience immediately.
But when the cast got together to do a read-through, everyone soon realized that it was still missing something essential. It was missing a narrative and thematic through line that connected everything and tied the story together. Enter Bill Nicholson, the third credited writer on Gladiator.
The script that I read was like a revenge movie. It was quite dark. The main character became very nihilistic. There was quite a lot of confusion in the plotting in the second half. Ridley and Doug and Walter wanted the plot sorted out, and they wanted the characters made more likable.
Now that's all very well and good, but remember, this movie had already been greenlit, and by the time Nicholson came on board, they were already filming. And so began one of the most frantic and chaotic screenwriting sagas in modern Hollywood history.
There's a lot of writing done 2 and 3 and 4 days before, a week before, the night before.
Well, I would meet every night with Ridley. We'd sit in, we'd work on dialogue and scenes. And actors would come to me, and we'd sit with Russell. I mean, it was all over the place. We'd get done about 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning, fax it over to Walter Parks at DreamWorks. He would write back his notes, we'd get those done, and then Ridley would be on his way to the set, and we'd hand him the pages.
But as insane and as chaotic as all of that sounds, it worked. And the reason it worked was because everyone involved had a shared understanding of what this movie was really about. Because despite it looking and feeling like a big action movie, everyone from Ridley Scott down knew that this wasn't a movie about sword fights or revenge, but it was about the character of Maximus.
You let go of the burden of we're somehow trying to recreate ancient Rome in a very specific period of time, and instead saying we're telling you a story of character.
The human loss that he experiences and how that motivates him, at least through the better part of the second act, gave the movie a drive that we didn't have before.
For all of its huge battle scenes, its testosterone-fueled combat, and casts of big muscly men with swords beating each other up, Gladiator is a story about the love Maximus has for his family and his grief that they were taken from him. Rather than simply making him the stereotype of a manly action hero, instead, the writers created a gladiator who does not want to be a warrior. And we see this right from the opening scene, where we see the brutality of war through his wary eyes. Despite what he says to hype up his soldiers, Maximus does not see glory in this, only futility, and the movie emphasizes that by choosing to show us the aftermath of the battle. And then, when Dumbledore asks him what reward he wants for his victory, his answer is this.
Let me go home.
This desire to return to his family stays with Maximus throughout the entire movie. His mission of vengeance only actually appears when he comes face to face with Commodus, which happens over halfway through the movie. In this moment, he realizes that revenge might be possible, but it was never his primary motive.
I personally don't want to go and see a movie about somebody who wants to kill somebody. I want to go and see a movie about somebody who loves somebody. How can I create a plot for this story that means that his drive is to be with the people he loves rather than to slaughter a monster? The slaughtering of the monster is good, I'm not against that, it's just not the end of the story for me. Not unless you're making, I think, a lower grade movie.
Whether he is a general with the Roman army or a slave in Morocco, Maximus is always being forced into fighting and violence against his will. But this is not what he wants, and the movie takes every chance it gets to emphasize this. From the very first time we see him taking simple pleasure in watching a bird fly away, through to scenes of him praying to his wife and child, and his open display of grief upon seeing their bodies. And when he finally gets given their figurines again, he once again wears his emotions openly and sincerely. Maximus's sense of identity and self-worth come not from the arena or the battlefield, but from here, and that is what makes him strong. It might sound strange to say this about someone who runs people through with spears, but to me, Maximus stands alongside characters like Aragorn as someone who firmly rejects the bullshit ideas of toxic masculinity that are almost unavoidable if you spend any sort of time online. Young men need male role models in popular culture who aren't afraid to show some emotional vulnerability, and who teach us that love and compassion are legions more heroic than hatred and violence as the qualities by which you should define your identity. You might get people's attention by giving these characters cool armor and a flashy sword, but you win their hearts by showing them what's inside, and by showing them that true strength comes not in these moments, but in these ones. This is why Gladiator was so successful, because it wasn't just a movie about sword fights. It was a movie about a character that people could actually identify with and look up to.
He was always going to be appealing to men. He was always a great fighter. But there are so many movies of great, tough fighters that are only watched by 16-year-old boys. You know, Gladiator isn't like that. Gladiator has, I think, something like 50% of its audience is women.
Maximus's sincerity and emotional heart was the north star of the story, and amidst all of the script debates and rewrites and arguments and faxes, it all came together because everyone knew what this movie was trying to do.
This isn't a revenge film. This is a movie about going home.
And this clarity of vision was something that extended beyond the script, because even though everyone had a healthy level of respect for the cinematic classics like 𝗙𝗪𝗥𝗧𝗏 and Ben-Hur, Ridley Scott and the production crew were adamant that they did not want Gladiator to look or feel like those movies.
You look back at the classic Gladiator movies, and oddly enough, there's some great writing and there's some wonderful actors involved, and the thing that really makes them feel cheesy is the way they look, and particularly the costumes.
In the same way Ridley Scott was never going to direct a movie with lofty theatrical dialogue in Latin, he was also never going to direct a movie that looked like every actor had just walked out of the costume department in a community theatre.
Looking back on the epics of yore, we really wanted to get away from that look. We wanted to ensure that everything looked very worn.
Filming took place in 3 main locations: England for the opening battle, Morocco for the slave quarters, and Malta for Rome, and it was there that they constructed a huge set for the Colosseum fights. About a third of this was built as a physical set to serve as a backdrop for the filming, with the rest being created digitally. And I think this is one of the reasons that Gladiator has aged so well. Ridley Scott has always been a director who embraces modern technology, but his first priority is creating the most realistic looking effect with whatever filmmaking tool can best achieve that. And when he was making Gladiator, he knew that the CGI of the time was perfectly capable of doing decent set extensions, backdrops, or duplicating extras to create an army and so on, but doing things like, say, a ship battle in the Colosseum was not going to happen. That would have to wait for the sequel.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
There are a few big special effects shots in Gladiator, of course, as well as dozens of smaller ones like in the tiger fight and so on, but generally, Scott saved the big effects for key establishing shots like the overhead shot of Rome, or key character moments like Maximus entering the Colosseum for the first time. But by using digital effects in this fairly strategic way, Ridley Scott ensured that the audience shared in the spectacle and scale of those moments when they do appear, while also ensuring that the rest of the film felt very grounded, because the limitations and costs of the effects stopped the production getting too carried away.
Well, I always wanted to do a rhinoceros. I'd have to build an animatronic. Also, a couple of good rhinos in there that'll function, real rhinos. But the big trick really is to do it CGI. The whole rhino thing would have cost us $3 million.
For the most part, the action was filmed the old-fashioned way, putting stunt guys in armor and telling them to beat the crap out of each other.
Now, can we literally kill him rather than punching him? We need to see an insertion.
Yeah, he punches him back and then he slashes him as he gets back.
Well, I think you need to do something really brutal, like chop his fucking head off.
But the thing about filming action scenes like this is that, well, people get hurt.
If you miss someone, your finger is gone, or you have a big cut in your arm.
We were starting to rehearse with wooden swords to make sure everyone's in the right place. One of the guys got his head cut open, stitched up.
But it was all worth it in the end because these battle scenes look fantastic. In fact, a lot of them were filmed using similar lenses and cinematography techniques to the battle scenes in Saving Private Ryan, another example of how this movie was bringing modern filmmaking to one of cinema's oldest genres. But unfortunately, it was not an on-set injury that resulted in the death of one of the cast members. As I mentioned at the start of the video, British acting legend Oliver Reed died in Malta 3 weeks before the end of shooting. Reed had struggled very publicly with alcohol for much of his career, and his profile had somewhat diminished in Hollywood circles. But Ridley Scott felt he was perfect for the role of Proximo and fought to have him cast. Reed promised Scott that he wouldn't drink during the production, only during his downtime on weekends, and he kept his word. By all accounts, he was a total professional on set, and as the production went on, everyone else began to understand why Ridley Scott had wanted to cast him.
And we were watching daily at the screening room at DreamWorks, and it was over, and we had this conversation about, my God, the world's going to rediscover Oliver Reed.
But during one of his weekends off, Reed is said to have gotten into a drinking match with a group of British Navy sailors. After collapsing, he died in the ambulance at the age of just 61.
It was shocking. I mean, I absolutely couldn't believe it. He dropped down dead. As he said, he'd be pissed off because he hadn't finished the movie. But yeah, there's great sadness to it.
Besides, of course, being a terrible tragedy for his friends, family, and colleagues, Reed's death was also yet another unexpected and unwanted complication for the Gladiator team. Proximo was never intended to die in the original script, but because Reed had not finished filming all of his scenes, his death prompted yet another rewrite to kill off the character, and then those scenes were filmed by combining unused footage of Reed and a body double.
The body double walks upstairs, but you need one shot of the real Oliver Reed before he dies.
Early on in the movie, Maximus confronts Proximo about the madness in the arena. And Proximo says,
We mortals are but shadows and dust. Shadows and dust, Maximus.
And in one take, he took this deep breath and he said,
Shadows and dust.
We cut him out from the shot, and as they're raising their daggers to kill him, he takes this breath and he says,
Shadows and dust.
By moving, it felt like a callback, like it was actually part of the fabric of the storytelling, but in fact it was just patched together.
Reed's death, the endless rewrites and arguments on set, the countless injuries and the huge budget, along with the fact that this genre of movie hadn't been successful for decades and it was being led by a relatively unknown star, all meant that expectations were not exactly high for Gladiator when it finally got released. But of course, the naysayers were proven wrong. Gladiator ended up making just under $500 million, and it was only beaten out by Mission Impossible 2 as the biggest movie of the year, which is funny considering that Tom Cruise was in the running to play Maximus. It was nominated for 12 Oscars and won 5, including Best Picture. And as they always do, Hollywood learned all the wrong lessons from this.
The minute it was a huge success, what that tells the studio bosses is, oh, there is an audience for this kind of thing out there. Let's make more of it. I think Gladiator found an audience because it's an excellent movie, not because it's about ancient Rome. I don't think you say, oh, that shows people want ancient Rome. No, what people want is great movies.
Despite that, Gladiator's success kicked off a wave of sword and sandals movies, and it wasn't long before the folks at DreamWorks started talking about a sequel, which was a problem because Maximus is very much Dedimus at the end of the movie. But Russell Crowe wasn't going to take that lying down, and so rather than turning to the screenwriters who wrote the Oscar-nominated screenplay for the original movie, he instead turned to Australian rock star Nick Cave, and even Nick himself admits that that was an odd thing to do.
I know Russell really well.
You do?
Eventually he rang me up at home and asked me if I wanted to write Gladiator 2. I'm like, hey Russell, didn't you die in Gladiator 1? He's going, yeah, you sort that out.
Now, if you like movies and spend your free time watching videos like this one, then chances are you've already heard about Nick Cave's script for Gladiator 2. But in case you somehow haven't heard about the crazy time-traveling immortal Russell Crowe Gladiator sequel, then oh man, are you in for a wild ride.
Yeah. All right, so he goes to purgatory.
Yeah.
And is sent down by the gods who are dying in heaven because there's this one god, there's this Christ character down on earth who is gaining popularity, and so they send Gladiator back to kill Christ and all his followers. I wanted to call it Christ Killer. And in the end, you find out that the main guy was his son, so he has to kill his son, and he's tricked by the gods and all of this sort of stuff. So it ends with this, he becomes this eternal warrior, and it ends with this 20-minute war sequence that follows all the wars of history right up to Vietnam and all of that sort of stuff. And it was wild.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, no, it was a stone cold masterpiece.
Okay, so obviously that's hilarious, and even though if you read the actual script, it's a bit less intense than Cave's description of it and doesn't actually involve any Christ killing, it's still developed a cult reputation as one of the weirdest sequels never made. But this is the point in the video when I say something potentially controversial, because my hot take on the Nick Cave Gladiator 2 script is that it's not, in and of itself, a bad idea. Like, come on, a movie about Roman gods and deities and a resurrected gladiator living throughout history like some sort of buff Forrest Gump, directed by Ridley Scott? That sounds fucking awesome. And I know, the reason the premise of a resurrected Maximus sounds so crazy as a sequel to Gladiator is because Gladiator was a gritty and realistic movie that was firmly grounded in history. So of course it makes no sense to make a sequel that delves into the supernatural. Or does it? Because the thing about the first Gladiator movie that I think people forget is that it is stuffed full of references to the afterlife.
For you are in Elysium, and you're already dead! What we do in life echoes in eternity.
Your family will meet you in the afterlife.
My wife and my son are already waiting for me.
You'll meet them again.
And I will have my vengeance, in this life or the next.
Can they hear you, your family, in the afterlife?
Oh yes.
Go to them.
And these references are not trivial. Remember earlier when I said that everyone felt the original script for Gladiator 1 lacked a narrative and thematic through line? Well, that is exactly why the idea of an afterlife became so central to the movie and to the character of Maximus.
Who does he love? He loves his wife and child. Given that he's going to die at the end of the movie, that was the structure I inherited. How can I create a plot for this story that means that his drive is to be with the people he loves rather than to slaughter a monster? The obvious answer was an afterlife. We thread this through the movie so that his actual aim is to rejoin his beloved wife and child in the next life, and in that way the act of dying becomes an act of winning, an act of triumph.
These characters, like the Romans themselves did, believe in the afterlife and believe in these gods, and that is what the entire first movie is built around. The movie even explicitly shows us Maximus in Elysium after he dies, for crying out loud, and literally plants the seed that he might return.
We'll see you again, but not yet.
So using this as the jumping off point for a sequel is not anywhere near as outrageous as it sounds, because all it is doing is taking the core idea of the original and building on it in new and unexpected ways, which is exactly what a good sequel should do. The effectiveness of any storytelling concept like this lies not in the idea itself, but in the execution. Like, on paper, Darth Vader being Luke's father, sorry, spoilers, is a terrible idea. It makes the world feel tiny, and it even directly contradicts something established in the first movie to the extent that it needed retconning in the sequel.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
But none of that matters because the execution is so damn perfect that it ended up becoming probably the most famous scene in movie history. People don't always know what they want, and some of the best sequels of all times are the ones that go in a completely different direction from the original and try to do something new. In the right universe, and maybe with some of the dialogue redrafted, I think that Ridley Scott could have pulled off some version of Nick Cave's weird Gladiator sequel. I say some version of it because you probably need to change that part at the end where he stays alive forever and keeps fighting in all the wars of history. Not because that's a bad idea, it's just that Maximus is Roman and therefore Italian, and so he wouldn't be fighting in all the American wars like Nick Cave's script implied. No, he'd be fighting in all the Italian wars, and, well, we all know which side of World War II the Italians were on, right?
Are we the baddies?
Anyway, this whole discussion is kind of pointless because Nick Cave's script never got off the ground, and as time moved on, the idea of a Gladiator sequel slowly faded away. DreamWorks and the rights to Gladiator got sold to Paramount, and audiences started to become less and less interested in this style of movie until Game of Thrones resurrected Hollywood's interest in the fantasy genre in a way not seen since The Lord of the Rings, and particularly as we started getting into the later seasons, every studio and their dog began scouring their lists of IP to find something similar. And so, much like Maximus and Nick Cave's script, the idea of a Gladiator sequel came back to life, with Ridley Scott talking about it publicly in early 2017. And as is the way of these things, it got kicked around in development for a while until Paramount finally confirmed it had greenlit the sequel in November 2018. But hang on, that was 6 years ago. What's taken so long? Well, it's not entirely clear, but from the various snippets in the entertainment media over the years, it seems that a lot of the uncertainty came down to whether or not Russell Crowe would be involved, which obviously delayed the development of a script. Then you had the pandemic, and all the while Ridley Scott, being an absolute workhorse of a director, pumped out 5 movies in 6 years, and remember, this guy is in his 80s.
They're gonna make him do this till he's 90.
Anyway, the most recent of these movies was Napoleon, and it was the screenwriter on that, David 𝗙𝗪𝗪, who finally cracked the script for a sequel, which would be set 2 decades after the original and will follow the story of Lucius, the son of Connie Nielsen's character in the first movie. And in a genius stroke of casting, instead of Russell Crowe and Joaquin Phoenix, Gladiator 2 will be led by Paul Mescal and Pedro Pascal, also known as the 2 sexiest men alive today besides Pierce Brosnan. You still got it, you old fox. Wait, where was I? Oh yeah, Gladiator 2 finally began filming in mid-2023 and saw the crew returning to Morocco and to Malta, which once again stood in for Rome. But after just a month or so of shooting, the Hollywood strikes kicked off and the entire production ground to a halt until December. The delays from the strikes cost the production as much as $10 million, but if the Hollywood Reporter is to be believed, then the total budget for this movie just kept getting out of hand, growing from $165 million to as much as $310 million. Even if you believe Paramount's claim that the budget was more like $250 million, that's still a hell of a lot of coin. But you know what? If it means Ridley Scott finally gets to show us a gladiator fighting a rhino, then I'll be happy. When Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe came to Rome to do the press tour for Gladiator nearly 25 years ago, I don't think they expected that they had made a movie that would go on to firmly earn its place as a cinema classic that will forever be remembered as one of the best movies of the 21st century.
You're really lucky if you have one film like that in your lifetime, right?
In your lifetime?
Yeah, just, you know, I'm not...
But you've had more than one. I mean, you've had A Beautiful Mind.
Yeah, but that's a different film. That's different. There's been some successes and there's been some great critical successes. Right. But that thing touches people on a different level, you know.
As for Gladiator 2, well, we'll have to wait and see what legacy that will leave, but I for one cannot be more excited, because the only other time the same director has returned to make a direct sequel to a Best Picture winning movie was when Francis Ford Coppola made The Godfather Part 2. That's a pretty high bar, but if anyone can meet it, it's Ridley Scott. It has taken a very, very long time to make a sequel to Gladiator, but, well, Rome wasn't built in a day either. Thanks for watching. Oh, and speaking as the guy who made the biggest Barbenheimer video on YouTube, glicked is not a thing, it will never be a thing, stop trying to recreate Barbenheimer. We did it once, we had a lot of fun with it, but it's over now. Find another way to market your movies. Okay, bye.